And I also have my Tuskegee Airman T-shirt on, so you can come up and look at and touch it too. That's fine. But I got this down at the Evergreen Air and Space Museum down in McMinnville a number of years ago, and I wear it a lot, but I try to keep it nice because I think the last time I was down there, they didn't have any. So we're going to talk about the Tuskegee Airmen. There's a lot of myth, a lot of truth, a lot of different opinions about a lot of things. But the Tuskegee Airmen did not just magically appear on the American scene. There were a few black flyers in the late 1800s and into the early 1900s. Many men flew during World War I. Other than that handful, there were very few who had been able to obtain an instructor to train them due to the race issue. Now, we're going to talk a lot about the race issue today. Bessie Coleman, however, there is an account of a 21-year-old black woman from Chicago who became not only excited about the prospect of flying, but made it happen. In 1917, just 14 years after the Wright brothers' maiden flight, her name was Bessie Coleman. She had been watching a newsreel in a movie theater that showed a French fighter pilot outmaneuver a German pilot and ultimately shoot him down. This excited her. She was realistic enough to know that blacks were not admitted to flight schools, and she was informed enough to know that the high cost of taking lessons was more than she had. But in spite of those obstacles in her mind, she really wanted to fly. She really wanted to be a pilot.
You want to click to her.
Oh, okay, I have to remember that. There's Bessie Coleman. That's her in front of her plane. And then, I don't think that's her plane. But anyway, there's a couple of her flying buddies. At the time, she was a manicurist, saving her money, hoping the opportunity would present itself. She even took on a second job in a restaurant to build her savings faster. Then in 1921, she got her first big-time break. Now, we're going to mention a guy named Robert Abbott. I don't have a picture of him, but he was the publisher of the Chicago Defender, and he knew many influential people who knew others. And this association got her in touch with a man named Eugene Ballard, who had learned to fly in France and had become a member of the famous flyers, the Lafayette Escadrille, a French-American air squadron in World War I. Abbott thought it would be a marvelous idea for Bessie to go to France and learn to fly. The French treated people as equals, no discrimination. And just one sidelight, I just mentioned the Wright brothers. I saw someplace, and I just kind of clicked in my head, that the Army bought their first airplane from the Wright brothers. So in 1921, Coleman took her savings, as well as the GoFundMe account collected from Mitty and others relocated to France for flying lessons. She successfully completed the curriculum and earned her license. When she returned home, she had become the second licensed black American pilot and the first licensed black female pilot. However, during those early days of flight, her flying was mostly in air shows where she did stunt flying, acrobatics, daredevil stuff. It paid the bills, though. Coleman's primary aim, there's another picture of Bullet. I don't want to go by that one. It was a boxer. So all these people lived just normal lives. They did all kinds of stuff. But Coleman's primary aim was to establish her own flying school so she could help as many black youths learn to fly as she possibly could. And she earned her earnings from air shows as seed money. Tragically, she was killed in a flying accident in April 1926, and her dreams seemingly died with her. Thankfully, others were as interested as she was in helping black youths become interested in flying and giving lessons. And one fellow was William Powell. I don't have a picture of him. William Powell, a well-to-do black businessman who had located a white flight school in Los Angeles to teach him to fly. And he founded the Bessie Coleman Aero Club and School in Los Angeles that gave air shows featuring both black and white pilots. Little information on Powell. Powell is also from Chicago. I'm from Chicago, so all these people are good people. But he was a busy entrepreneurial type, a keen business visionary with varied interests. He believed that achievements by black pilots would demonstrate black talent and capability and thus lead to decreased segregation and discrimination. He wrote a book, Black Wings, about a young man who wanted to fly. It was about himself. He produced a film, Underemployment, the Negro and Aviation, about the African American aviation. And he circulated a newsletter called the Craftsman's Aero News, which he claimed to be the first African American trade journal. Now, the story of the history of flight and the aerospace story has long been a litany of black struggle for the right to be in the same room, much less on the same stage of success. Powell was determined to do his flight training in the U.S. and obtain the United States pilot's license because he was American. He succeeded even though it cost him big bucks to uproot his family from Chicago and relocate to Los Angeles, and then again to dig deep in his own pockets to pay a white flight school $1,000 to train him. In today's money, that's $13,400. I will take a quote from Colin Powell, who we all know about. I have doubts that Colin is a descendant of William Powell, but could be. Colin Powell observed that a dream doesn't become reality through magic. It takes sweat, determination, and hard work. And dare say it takes big bucks. William Powell was born July 27, 1897, and he died July 12, 42. He was only 44 years old. His early death may have been caused by poison gas that he was exposed to during World War I. This one is a kind of out of order, but that's okay because I'll mention the amount of pilots that went to Europe during World War I. And I looked at this picture. I didn't see any black guys in here, but a lot of black guys went to Europe because they could not fly with the United States. And this is a picture of some of they're all biplanes that they used. Pilots were flying in increasing numbers as more black flight schools were founded and blacks became better able to afford flight lessons. And to just be able to circumvent the prejudice of white schools was a reward in itself. They didn't even have to go in that door. Moreover, airshow flying encouraged increasing numbers of black pilots to participate so they could show off their skills while making money in an exciting manner. An extension from this was the possibility of long-distance flights, which began to expand people's minds to purposes of hauling passengers and cargo. Amelia Earhart, Charles Lindbergh, and their long-endurance flights began to be noticed as a way to earn a good living. Black pilots earned notice too. Starting in 1926, there was continually a trip being planned, being flown, or finishing. Here's two significant examples. I don't have a picture of James Banning or Thomas Allen, but on September 18, 1932, Banning and his mechanic, Thomas Allen, took off from Los Angeles to attempt an endurance flight to New York. Even then, most endurance flights were financed by large corporate sponsors who were happy to buddy up with these flights being done by white flyers. Banning could not land a sponsor, but he and Allen, along with $100 for gas and oil, took off anyway. They called themselves the Flying Hobos. Whenever they landed for the night or for bad weather, they would make their way to the colored part of town where they were treated to a meal and a bed. Finally, they ran out of money, forcing them to scramble for financing. They were able to convince a Texas oil dealer to give them oil and gas on credit so they could continue the trip. Then they had a major breakdown over St. Louis, Missouri. Their engine failed and they had to get it repaired, which was a task the mechanic Allen could not accomplish without money for parts and a place to work. A white trade school heard of their dilemma and offered to make the repairs as part of their training, and soon Bannon and Allen were back in the air. Incidentally, the instructors suggested that they use valves from a 1928 Nash automobile. Some of you might remember what the old Nashes were. I imagine so. There is more to their cross-country story, but 3 weeks after they took off from Los Angeles, they landed in Long Island, New York. And yes, they had received a lot of help, a lot of white help along the way. And they became the first black pilots to fly coast to coast. Here we have Alfred Anderson and Albert Forsyth. This Forsyth, and that's Anderson, that's Forsyth. There we go. Albert Forsyth was a doctor, and I forgot to put it before his name. But this story is of a true endurance flying. Alfred Anderson and Dr. Albert Forsyth, both pilots, began their adventure in July 1933 by flying from Atlantic City to Los Angeles, then back to New York, finally returning to the West Coast, eventually landing in San Francisco. Anderson was the main pilot, and Forsyth, a pilot also, but also a physician, provided financial backing. A few weeks later, they flew to Canada. In 1934, they embarked on what they dubbed the Pan American Goodwill Flight. And there was a poster of that was made. But the Goodwill Flight, they named their plane the Booker T. Washington. There it is. And I have seen the name in some of the reading I was doing, the Spirit of Booker T. Washington. They began in Miami and made several stops in the Caribbean, Cuba, Jamaica, Puerto Rico. Their mission was to demonstrate the skill and ability of black pilots and also to encourage blacks and whites to establish better relations with each other. Moreover, this mission carried a new and wonderful characteristic. It was happily supported by the United States government. The U.S. State Department provided money, guidance, and valuable assistance to the pilots and their effort. Their itinerary was widely publicized. Consequently, the pilots were welcomed at each stop with cheering crowds, many of whom had toiled to forge a dirt runway out of the farms and jungles. Others lined up autos to mark out landing strips during night conditions. Unfortunately, the flights came to an abrupt end in Trinidad when the aircraft was damaged as they tried to land on one of those dirt runways. But their purpose had been fulfilled as blacks in America and their Caribbean brothers and sisters birthed with pride over these two daring black pilots. I think I have another picture of them. Yeah, there they are again. They were, this was in the Virgin Islands, and they got royal treatment wherever they went. I showed a picture earlier of black fighters or fighters in World War I. But during the 1930s, there was a lot happening countrywide among black pilots, and not just in the air. Many flying associations were formed and more flight schools established. In 1933, a black couple, both pilots, founded the Negro Airmen International Incorporated. This was a national flying club of their own, because they were still excluded from white clubs and associations. Although the U.S. was not at war, many pilots of both races were volunteering to fight for European forces during World War I. Of course, the black men were continually challenging white refusal to let them become a part of our fighting forces. One fellow, John Robinson, I don't have a picture of him, was the president of the Challenger Air Pilot Association, and he led a group of black pilots to Ethiopia, where they hoped to help Emperor Haile Selassie build an air force to fight in his country battle with invading Italian forces. The Italians overran the Ethiopians during the effort before it got off the ground, but black pilots did not stop there. Throughout Europe, there were other skirmishes which were leading up to the start of World War II, and these black pilots, anxious to be a part of the U.S. Army Air Force, were eager to be with any country in order to be in on that action while gaining piloting skills. Everything blacks did was apparently not enough to satisfy Jim Crow, as they continued to beat on the doors of prejudice and as they struggled to join the armed forces as pilots and support personnel. Through these intervening years, while segregation in armed forces was the norm, civil rights associations such as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People filed lawsuit after lawsuit in the federal government and the Department of Defense as they provided level-headed correcting of misconceptions and blatant falsehoods regarding black people. Political pressure heightened even more as black civilians continued to voice their sentiments in a quiet yet stern manner. The black press kept a steady drumbeat also. Two of the more active and outspoken newspapers were the Pittsburgh Courier and the Chicago Defender. I lived in Chicago, and we just talked about that until my late 20s, so I was very, very familiar with the Chicago Defender. All of this was having a critical effect while hammering away at the race problem. Then two bits of legislation made in April 1939 seemed to be the game changer, but let me point out that it didn't happen overnight. There were many hate-filled meetings, proposals were written and tossed in the trash, and a lot of ideas on how to continually keep the black man down and out of consideration. But the pressure continued. A. Philip Randolph, founder of the Sleeping Car Porters, and Walter White, the current secretary of the NAACP, along with other prominent blacks, made one of their many visits to President Franklin Roosevelt, carrying demands with various ideas to the government. What followed was Public Law 18 passed by Congress. There was no change in pictures. I don't have any of this in this particular section, so just have to listen to me. But the law authorizes civilian schools to train pilots for military flying. Not surprisingly, there was immediate backlash and rejection of the idea, and the most effective way to reject it was to not fund it. Then things changed. On June 27, 1939, the Civilian Pilot Training Act was signed, which authorized $7 million per year funding. So there they had the funding to back up Law 18. The United States government, along with the War Department, was fairly certain they would not be able to remain. Oh yeah, I wanted to mention this. These are three incidents that are seemingly unrelated that really changed what was happening. The first one was the United States government, along with the War Department, was fairly certain they would not be able to remain neutral regarding the European conflict and would be drawn into a war. Number two, they knew if they were sucked in, their air component was not near up to par or readiness to make even a good showing, much less slow down the German air juggernaut. And the last, the War Department realized that military-only training could not train enough pilots and support personnel, white and black, to meet the challenge. Thus, Public Law 18 and the Civilian Pilot Training Program funding. This was a scary proposition. They knew they were going to get in a war, and they didn't have the manpower to fight the war. And so that allowed black people to begin to be part of the system. The law did not originally apply to black colleges and universities. However, at the last moment, Senator Harry Swartz of Wyoming squeezed in an amendment which allowed black colleges into the program as part of the civilian pilot training program. And this was by mandating the War Department to lend aviation equipment to at least 2 black colleges, allowing African Americans to be a part of this, thereby receiving the same treatment, but still only at black colleges and universities. No, the War Department hadn't suddenly become more inclusive for fairness or equality, but the reality that the U.S. was getting drawn into the European War, World War II, added to this game-changing scenario. Congress, being caught between a rock and a hard place, authorized the Civil Aeronautic Authority, this is CAA, to allow the civilian pilot training program to establish a flying program at a few select black colleges. And Tuskegee Institute in Tuskegee, Alabama was one of them. The main provision set an aggressive goal of 20,000 college students nationwide per year to receive pilot training in order to build a reserve of pilots in case of war. West Virginia State was the first black college to be approved. Then others followed. Still, the Air Corps did not budge. They could continue to refuse to accept any black graduate to the program. Over the span of a few years, 400,000 pilots had successfully completed a curriculum, with 2,700 of them black. The difference was that all the black applicants were rejected entrance into the Army Air Corps. The Army Air Corps really had a stiff back. And all received the identical notice: no black flying units, no need for black pilots. In other words, there was no place for them to go once they learned how to fly or whatever they did. So if there's no place, no unit for you to go to, no flying unit, we don't need you. So the stalemate remained. In 1940, a white candidate, Wendell Willkie, campaigned for presidency against the incumbent Franklin Roosevelt on the promise that if he were elected, he would end segregation in the military. Roosevelt knew this would be a tall order for anyone, and he also knew he would have to be beaten by a much better candidate. Nevertheless, he felt the heat to make a strong showing, so he made tactical moves to shore up his position. One of these moves was to promote U.S. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., Benjamin O. Davis, Sr., the highest ranking black in the military at that time, to the rank of Brigadier General. This was a well-deserved promotion for Colonel Davis, and one Roosevelt hoped would cause black voters to forget Willkie and continue supporting him. But with all these tactical moves, with so much legislative wrangling, the military continued to reject the notion of an integrated army and any idea of black pilots. Finally, the Army Air Corps had been under pressure to allow blacks to fly military aircraft, but still did not allow for integrated units. In January 1941, the Air Corps made a crucial decision following a mandate by the War Department to establish an all-black fighter squadron. Steps were taken to make it happen. They were really getting crunched to the idea that we've got to get more pilots in the air. It called for the fighter squadron designated as the 99th Fighter Squadron to be formed. The pursuit designation was later changed to Fighter Squadron. The plans to jumpstart what was considered an experiment called for a complement of 33 to 35 pilots and 278 ground crew members. The first officers would be white, and once black officers became trained, they would filter in, which would eventually make this unit and future squadrons all black. They would call this the Tuskegee Airmen Experiment. I'm not sure what the next picture is. I want to elevate Eleanor Roosevelt's picture because she and her husband, Franklin, were really involved in this. But I want to talk about the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment. Beginning in the late 1990s and on into the early 2000s, a movement has been discussed to correct a confusion of terminology. The aviation program at Tuskegee Institute was originally named and referred to as the Tuskegee Experiment by the U.S. government, by the Army, and by the Air Corps. As it turned out, there had been another experiment, the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, that was begun in 1932 in reference to a secret medical research done on African American men in that part of Alabama for the treatment of syphilis. And this correcting movement is to rename the aviation program at Tuskegee Experience. So it changed it from Tuskegee Airmen Experiment to the Tuskegee Airmen Experience. And that's been used for 20-some years now. There will be a time or two in the talk when I will make a direct quote, and it might say experiment, but I'm going to use experience as much as possible. Tuskegee, Alabama, chosen. And again, I want to mention something about this picture here. A lot of you probably saw the movie, the Tuskegee Airmen, and if you saw it, she's at the school, and she wants to take a flight. So she said, "I want to take a flight," and she says, "I like him to fly me." Well, the perception is that him is one of the cadets. If it was, that's wrong, because she used a competent pilot. In fact, this man had been chosen to be their pilot trainer. So anyway, and this is him right here. He was chosen to be their pilot trainer. Here she is shaking hands with black people. It was surprising to read that, and she had shaken the hand of some black man, and there was all this kind of controversy, kind of like a lot of controversy we get today in our news. But the War Department had been actively searching for a location to establish the all-black pilot training. We're doing okay. Tuskegee Institute had been actively involved in the early stages of settling on a spot. They had been one of the colleges to receive funds as part of the civilian pilot training program, so we're an early on favorite. Another city was, here we go with Chicago again, but the mild weather in southeastern Alabama certainly helped their cause. This did, however, play into the Army's nasty habit of stationing blacks on bases in the South, where they were continually discriminated against by expert segregationists. And this made it hard on men raised in the North who were not up to speed on many of these nuances of prejudice, segregation, and Jim Crow. Moreover, as the Army began to establish more newly open bases in the South, Jim Crow laws lifted from the South became more evident in the North. What I'm going to say now is a bit true, but it is not an excuse, because there is never an excuse for hatred or bigotry, never a reason to discriminate, or for any racial hatred to be forced on a member of a race or a group of human beings different from what we are. But for the sake of argument, the widespread belief that black people were inferior to white people stemmed from slavery. Since a majority of military officers were from the South, it was not only natural for their way of thinking to remain with them after slavery ended, and even though they were going on 80 years of non-slavery, they did not let up their segregationist ways. We are well aware of the prejudice was haunting the Tuskegee Airmen every step of the way, primarily in the southern towns. Excuse me. I never know what my breath is going to do, so I never know what will happen. Well, we are well aware of the prejudice which haunted the Tuskegee Airmen every step of their way, primarily in the southern towns, where they were based, but also in the north, due to so many southern military officers in command positions. One large sticking point was the cry for blacks for non-segregated accommodations, along with equal training and ranking. This inequality not only affected the servicemen themselves, but their family and civilian support along with them found living conditions, these people are living outside the base, mostly intolerable. The training center being put in Alabama as an afterthought seemed to prove this notion correct. But for whatever it was worth, the U.S. government had finally become willing to spend the money to train blacks to fly warplanes. The area around Tuskegee, Alabama grew as a result of the infrastructure built to accommodate them. Classrooms, mess hall with lounge areas, airfields, runways, hangars, and mechanic shop. And work was progressing even as the 13 beginners were being trained. The Tuskegee Airmen and their large following showed great determination and tenacity amidst the segregation and exclusion they had to endure. The town of Tuskegee was anything but welcoming. When the cities learned an airfield was under construction at the college, they petitioned state government to halt the construction. But when they heard that the airfield, Moton Field, would be 6 miles outside town, their ardor began to wane. But they did not extend the welcome mat. The exceedingly cruel and hateful local sheriff did all in his power to make certain the airmen were treated harshly when they came into town. The town folks made little or no room for the families and civilian support staff to find adequate housing or markets to buy necessity such as clothing and food. This Southern Jim Crow was difficult for most of the northern blacks to understand and get used to, especially depending on the northern city they had moved from and what kind of shopping experience they were used to. Many had not been exposed to the most blatant kind, such as having to trace their child's foot on a piece of cardboard and take it to the shoe store to purchase shoes for their children. I certainly remember having to do it for my mom in Chicago. Now, we weren't in the military, and this was not an every time thing, but there were times she wanted to shop a certain store in order to get a better fitting shoe for my awkward feet. And she knew the drill. Blacks were not permitted to try on shoes or clothing in a store. You try it home, you try it on, you wear it home. That's tough to take. On July 19, 1941, the first class of 13 cadets, I think no, we don't. Okay, I'm going to go back to that one. The first 13 cadets were sworn in to begin the rigorous training necessary for becoming flight pilots in the U.S. Army Air Corps. Here I'd like to read an excerpt from a book, The Tuskegee Airmen, Black Heroes in World War II, written by Jacqueline Harris, and she was a Tuskegee Airman historian. Didn't say she was a Tuskegee Airman, so I guess she wasn't. This first quote was made by Major General Walter Weaver, commander of the U.S. Army Southern Training Command, as he spoke these words of encouragement at the induction ceremony. He said, "The eyes of your country and the eyes of your people are upon you. The success of this venture depends on you. Now he's talking to these 13 men. Also during the ceremony, there were the use of congratulatory telegrams read, as well as speeches of sentimental words spoken for the first class of Tuskegee Airmen. These 13 would pave the way into the skies for thousands more black pilots and their support staff. Of course, the men were jubilant, yet subdued, because the deep down meaning had yet to hit them. On the contrary, there were many skeptical Air Corps officers in attendance who took the entire procedure as a comical waste of time. In fact, one officer told another one, and this other one was going to be one of the hands-on officers with the first class. He said, to not worry about standards, just try to keep them happy. Another officer with grave doubts about the program was heard to express his fears that contributing to the power of blacks would probably fuel a war between blacks and whites. But he shrugged and said, we just do our jobs. Needless to say, whites expected the entire experience to fail. The U.S. War Department, from the U.S. War Department generals on down to the lowest private, and of course America's white civilians, mostly wanted and truly expected this failure. But the blacks, for these men to leave their homes and relocate to southeastern Alabama just to fail, it was a preposterous thought. Why go to fail? Why indeed? Fortunately, those words coming from deep within showed the true sentiment of America were not the last words. Again, quoting Major General Weaver as he addressed the 13, he spoke not only to them, but to the family members and others in attendance, and to all of Black America with these words: for God's sake, send us your best men. For their sake and for our sake, give us your best. End quote. And this was accomplished as best as it could be. The early cadets were college grads and college students. The elite among them was Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. We'll show that one. Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. He was not just any college graduate. He was an officer of the U.S. Army by virtue of his graduation from the United States Military Academy at West Point. As time went on and the pool began to flatten out, the elite began to come from high school graduates aspiring to fly. The low point for any who washed out was not an envious prospect. All had joined the Army, and those who washed out became just regular Army, meaning most were relegated to the life of a black soldier, cleaning, washing, and cooking. The overall total experience did not fail, though. Certainly, plenty of individual men washed out, and each one that did felt the failure as a failure not only to themselves, but to their entire family, their friends, neighbors, their community, and their race. To be told you failed and were no longer in the program was tough to take. But for those who continued, life did not get easier. The constant reminder that they were in it to fail was all pervasive. How does one succeed with that kind of negative pressure being applied to you by your leaders? Just to lighten it up a little bit, it's estimated that 2,400 candidates entered primary as the first phase of training, and it's estimated that the elimination rate averaged 60%. Now, this was a little off standard, but it was rumored that since there was nowhere for the cadets to go following graduation, the washout rate may have been higher than under normal circumstances, so as not to overcrowd the housing and other facilities at Tuskegee for the ones that graduated. Any quicker, they felt that they needed a room and so they didn't graduate as many. This seems cruel and slanted, but so was most of the fellows' lives. One thing about the training phases, there were two different interpretations. One said there were 4 phases of flight training: pre-flight, primary, basic, and advanced. And then there were 3 others that said there were 3 flight phases: primary, basic, and advanced. So you take that for what it's worth. At the beginning of World War II, the U.S. Army had 2 black line officers. Benjamin O. Davis Sr., whoops, didn't move. It's supposed to go back.
Let me see if it's turned off or something.
Oh.
Maybe the batteries went off.
Well, we flashed over that first one. Maybe we can get it back. Just 1, I think 2 back. Benjamin O. Davis Sr. and his son Benjamin O. Davis Jr. They were shining examples of what a truly dedicated black soldier looked like. However, the clamoring for blacks to become an integral part of the United States military was having a real effect on the U.S. government, but not enough to effect a measurable change. Yet both of these men were very effective in their fight against foreign enemies, and also against a more intense and insidious enemy here in the United States. And I personally can commend both of them. Benjamin O. Davis Jr., or Sr., was born on July 1977. I don't have his birthday. Where he was raised with Army in his DNA. His father had been in the Army, and I think his grandfather. Oh, will it go back now? Okay, that's Benjamin O. Davis Sr. Thank you. He began his military career at the start of the Spanish-American War as a temporary first lieutenant in an all-black unit. Following that war, he became part of the 9th Cavalry Unit of the Buffalo Soldiers. During his 50 years of service beginning in 1898 in the United States Army, he fought in 4 wars. He became the first black brigadier general during World War II. He served as the European theater as an advisor on race relations, championing the idea of an all-inclusive armed services. 6 days after Davis retired, President Truman issued the order ending racial discrimination in the military. That happened on July 26, 1948. Certainly much too late to alleviate the trials the Tuskegee Airmen had to endure. And then Davis became the 20th American to be honored on a Black Heritage First Day cover. So you can see him there. And in this, he's shown on an inspection tour of the American front in France in 1944. He retired with the rank of Brigadier General, and we talked about that when Roosevelt made him a Brigadier General in 1940. And he died on November 26, 1970, at the age of 93 in Chicago. November 26 happens to be my birthday. Davis Jr. was born, he's right. Which one is he? I don't think that's him. He's one of those 2 guys, it's hard to tell. Davis Jr. was born on December 18, 1912, also in D.C. Following high school graduation, he attended the University of Chicago, but only for a short tenure. He was sponsored to the Army Military Academy at West Point by the only black member of Congress, Chicago Representative Oscar DePriest, Republican, Illinois. Davis was accepted. However, the entire student body made his 4 years there a desolate and lonely experience. Only a few spoke to him, and then mostly to communicate official business in an official capacity. He bunked alone, ate alone, studied alone, was isolated and alone for 4 years. His classmates' purpose was to drive him to resign his appointment and quit. During Davis's junior year at the academy, he applied for the Army Air Corps. He knew he was going to be graduating the next year, so he wanted to get his application in. So he persevered and graduated with the class of 36 after all that being by himself. He was 35th out of a class of 276. He was the Academy's 4th black graduate. When he graduated, there were only 2 black officers in the U.S. Army, his father and himself. Both of these men were rare specimens in the Army, so they were continually selected for any duty which required black leadership. When Davis Jr. graduated from the Academy, he was assigned to the 24th Infantry Regiment of the Buffalo Soldiers, so he was following his dad. One extremely prejudicial blow to him was his being rejected entrance into the Army Air Corps in spite of his exemplary Academy record, which was supposed to earn him any spot in the Army he chose. Both father and son took a turn as a professor at Tuskegee Institute. This was a way for the Army to put the Davises to use without them being in command of white soldiers. Let's see what else we have here. There is when I was listening or reading this, I kept saying, it's good this guy didn't wash out. I mean, he put himself, all the stuff that he went through at the academy, and he knew he had the academics, but he could have very easily goofed up on his flying or some of his piloting stuff, but he didn't. This is a picture of his dad and him. You can see in his army gear. That was the day of his graduation from the Naval. Getting all the academies confused. The Army Academy. Our son went to the Naval Academy, so we have a little idea of that. And I think about the fun times Eric had as a midshipman. He's still very, very much in touch with hundreds of guys that he went to school with. It's a family that will never be taken away from him. And to think that Benjamin O. Davis was denied that. And just a bit about their training facilities. Tuskegee Institute, already a full-scale college, contained all the facilities necessary to train the Tuskegee Airmen. However, the War Departments were ready to spend the money to establish a top flight, and this is the first time I'll use this term today, equal but separate training facility for their experimental air base. The college was a few miles outside of Tuskegee, and the training took place were perfect and paid a perfect and excellent location in which to establish the facility. And there were 2 facilities. One was called the Tuskegee Army Airfield, and the other was Moulton Field. Moulton Field was where the pre-flight and first phases of flying were done. So the military built a control tower, 2 hangars, a locker room, a locker building, clubhouse, offices, and storage buildings, and a vehicle maintenance facility. And I'm not sure, they either built 1 runway or 2 runways there, but it was really a top-notch airport to facilitate the training. There was an effort to keep these, everything else was taught and or located at the college, at their training base by the college or in the college itself. Although the use of the college facilities was limited, there was an effort to keep these 2 entities as separate as possible. And there's one overlooked group with a support staff that was going to support this group as they got going. They were all trained at Chanute Field in southern Illinois, and included in their training focus was airplane mechanics, supply clerks, armorers, and weather forecasters. Okay, I'm going to continue because I have fair amount of more things to cover. At the beginning of World War II, the U.S. Army had we talked about the two line officers, but there were three events which helped move the Tuskegee Airmen along. And these were three fairly different kind of events. The first one, and we showed a picture of Eleanor Roosevelt, so I'm not going to try to go back to it. But Eleanor Roosevelt's desire to visit the training facility, and soon after the experiment or the experience got underway, she did indeed tour, and she demanded a flight. And her pilot, we saw the pilot in there, his name was Charles Chief Anderson. He was an accomplished pilot, a self-taught black man, and a very good aviator. And Tuskegee had hired him to be his chief flight instructor. So when this first 13 got in there, they met Chief Anderson. And the last is the naming of Captain Noel Parrish, a director of training. Parrish was seemingly the only white person among the millions in all of America with a strong voice and with sufficient ability to make decisions on behalf of black aviators and black aviation in this country. I'm going to read a bio on Parrish. Noel Parrish, November 11th, 1909 to April 7th, 1987. And I think there he is. Okay. I'll just go ahead and explain the pictures. That's Parrish right there. And that's Parrish. And this is Ben Davis Sr. and Ben Davis Jr. Born in Kentucky, Noel spent part of his life in Alabama and Georgia. He graduated from a high school in Cullman, Alabama, then entered college at Rice Institute in Houston, Texas in 1928. He continued on in graduate school but became restless, so dropped out of school and hitchhiked to San Francisco. He found little work which forced him to make some hard choices in order to eat. The best option, he felt, would be to join the Army, and he was based a few miles south in Monterey, California. His college degree seemingly did not matter much because he went in as a private, spending his first year in the horse cavalry. But he let word out that he wanted to fly. He was accepted in flight school and successfully completed the required training, and by July of 1935 had joined an attack squadron as assistant operations officer. Oddly enough, part of his duties in flying squadrons was either as flight instructor or as an operations officer position. Soon we will see how his flight instructing as well as his organizational skills played a huge part in the next phase of his military life. In March 1941, as an Army captain, he was named Assistant Director of Training at Tuskegee for the new experiment, we were still calling it, to train black men to be fighter pilots. Without getting too far ahead in the story, Parrish seemed to be to find his true calling. Through the years, the Army offered him many positions of greater responsibility and certainly with more prestige, but he turned them down. Very few officers were tickled to be assigned to this experiment, but Parrish even turned down a long-desired combat command to remain at Tuskegee with the Tuskegee Airmen as their primary flight instructor. He was a flight instructor along with Stewart. And in December 42, he assumed command of Tuskegee Army Airfield. Very quickly, it became evident that Parrish was made of a different stuff than most other white Army officers. His strong opinion was, why not train these pilots together and use the saved resources for other essentials such as winning a war. He did not want any man to fail, but in reality knew that many would. Also, he knew that with a certain amount of success, the program would survive. Sorry about that. The program would survive because proof would be shown that black men could fly and greatly assist in defending the U.S. from the air. The cadets misunderstood him at times, but he gradually got them turned around to his way of thinking, and thus to his methods. He demanded extremely high standards from his students. The eyes of America, the eyes of the world, were on Tuskegee experience, and Parrish did not want his men to fail. He was committed to total victory and triumph over white doubt. He felt that people should be judged by their capabilities, not their color. He made numerous trips to Washington, D.C., and following one particularly hard trip, depressed over the strong resentment and resistance over the program, that he knew he had to light a spark. He went to his pilots and encouraged them all the more to succeed. It was up to them to keep it happening. Parrish had many detractors who tried to discredit him, his motives, and his methods. For example, he required his officers to stop taking their meals in a separate facility on base for them to eat in and with the men. You can't imagine their joyful reaction at this order. Then he followed up with this point-blank option. He told them he would accept the resignation on the spot of any who did not want to follow that order. None resigned. He stood up for them. He protected them. He strongly encouraged them to succeed. He invited black entertainers and sports figures to come on base and entertain the men. He personally welcomed these guests and enjoyed the entertainment along with his men. After his death, his wife was interviewed, and she said her husband's position was misunderstood to a certain degree. Yes, he wanted an integrated military, but his primary concern was the amount of resources the government was squandering to support identical yet racially divided pilot training. Parrish did not like the idea of separate but equal when it came to Army Corps training facilities. He was commander of Tuskegee Airfield, Moulton Field, after the war in 45 until August 46, when the field was closed. He died April 7th, 87, and Lieutenant General Benjamin O. Davis said this: "He may have been the only white person who believed that blacks could learn to fly airplanes." End quote. Not only did Parrish have detractors, but he had many pseudo-fans who were eager to learn more about the black under his command. Now here's 3 questions asked of him in all sincerity. But first, let me ask you, these are you, 2 questions. Have any of you ever been asked, how do you know when your hands are dirty? Or how do you know when your hands are clean? I didn't think so. I never did count the times I've been asked that as a kid growing up in a white suburban city north of Chicago. All I know is it was plenty. Major Parrish was not asked these 2 questions, but he was asked the next 3. The first one, how do Negroes fly? Second one, are blacks better flyers because they're closer to nature? And the last one, are those really Negroes up there, or are you doing it for them? Now, he's going to fly more than one plane at a time? I don't think so. Every phase of aviation, every walk of life was represented by blacks who were sought after by the Army Air Corps. This was a little change in pace. Sorry about that. I had to get over the deep stuff and get to something a little more shallow to support the Tuskegee experience. Mechanics, technicians, meteorologists. Instructors, cooks, medical workers, and physicians, absolutely all phases of life while fighting a war, were trained, and the Army obtained the best people available from all over the country to fill these non-flying positions. It has been noted that many of those chosen for non-flying positions deep down wanted to become pilots. Many were too old or physically unfit for other reasons, say bad eyesight. Others were disillusioned because their expertise was needed for non-flying needs of greater value. Regardless, every one of these people down to their core believed in the program and did their utmost to get each and every cadet into a position to succeed and keep them there, thereby keeping the program in a position to succeed. Now that sounds kind of negative in some respect, but it gave a lot of black people some excellent jobs. It gave a lot of black people some jobs of responsibility and position. And here's one prime example. As Tuskegee was assembling the medical corps, they hired a woman named Della H. Rainey as a chief nurse, and that's Della. With this hiring, Della Rainey racked up a number of firsts. She was the first African-American nurse to report for duty in World War II. She was the first black to be appointed as a chief nurse, and she was the first black to be appointed to the rank of first lieutenant. Now, this is another group of nurses that were in the nurses flying corps, and Della Rainey is in that picture, but I don't know which one she is. So it's like I say, it gave a lot of black people some really good jobs, some good training, and the opportunity to show a lot of stuff that they could do without having to fight so hard for it. Out of all those who aspire to become pilots, as mentioned, only those considered to be elite were chosen. Even then, from among the elite, many were not born to fly, and they washed out eventually, so the real cream rose to the top. The selection process had to be strict and exacting. No instructor was willing to go up with a trainee pilot while fearing for his life. Errors in the classroom were one thing. Piloting errors on the ground or in the air were evaluated, and those with no forgiveness factor allowance resulted in immediate ejection from the program. However, the civilians instructors, both black and white, pushed the cadets hard to do well, to exceed. Few instructors wanted a candidate to fail, and they took each washout very hard. The candidates were, for the most part, pleased with their instructors. Also, they were subject to the most fair treatment within the confines of the Tuskegee Army Airfield, where they lived, studied, and trained. There was one story about a few flight instructors who used the washout process more than necessary, and one of them was called the washing machine since he washed out so many. Benjamin O. Davis was one of the first 13 on let me take this off here now. I had to be walking around a little bit. Let me see. I'll just put it over my that'll be okay. I think it's off. There we go. Thank you, Dwayne. Glad I have Dwayne with me today. Appreciate that. Benjamin Davis was one of the first 13. On graduation day, only 5 had successfully completed the coursework and earned their wings. Actually, the Army Air Corps was surprised that these 5 succeeded. For Davis, having successfully earned his wings and having obtained his degree from West Point, making him an officer as well as having been in the Army in excess of 5 years, it just seemed natural for him to be chosen as the commander of the 1st All-Black Air Unit, the 99th Fighter Squadron. These cadets trained relentlessly, and I'm not sure if I have... No, I don't. There was one picture that I wanted to put in, but it got lost. These cadets trained relentlessly and perfected their skills so well, and they began to be noticed for special accommodation. Now, this is just training. Likewise, their ground crews became fast enough at changing out engines. They began changing them in a third of the time of the white mechanics. They were ready to fly and fight. They had been declared in excellent condition and ready for immediate departure overseas by an inspecting general during an inspection in October 1942. There was nowhere for them to go, so they continued practicing and getting better. But their buildings were becoming overcrowded because they were not able to leave. Each class that graduated continued on their training relentlessly. Fortunately, the Army supplied them with enough fuel to keep their planes in the air. Finally, to war. I'm going to just talk about this a little bit. But the fighters, they were ready to leave the summer of 1942. This was after they had first completed training, and there were enough to field the whole squadron, but it was primarily the 99th that was going to go. But on April 3rd, 1943, almost a year later, and after many, many false alarms, they boarded a train for New York, and on April 15th, they boarded the SS Mariposa, a converted luxury ship to be transported across the Atlantic. There were 3,500 white troops and 400 blacks, including pilots and ground support. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis Jr. was selected to be in command of all 3,900 on the ship. They headed for Casablanca, Morocco, and on April 24th to begin preparing to engage the enemy. When this first group of black pilots and their support personnel landed in North Africa, they were there to fight and destroy the enemy. The identical enemy the white fellows were there to defeat. However, the blacks were isolated from the first moment on the ground. They were set in a nearby dusty field with nothing but tents to sleep in and protect them from whatever the elements threw their way. Their cots did not arrive with them, so they slept on the ground. They cooked on the ground with whatever they could find that burned, and they dug trenches for toilets. There was little available to provide privacy. They were denied access to any and all amenities enjoyed by the others in the Army Air Corps, and that's just right across the fence. The whites who sent them neglected them in order to break their spirits to the extent that they would call it quits and request a return trip home. The 99th waited, and their waiting was just beginning because the war in North Africa was winding down, and the Army had to come up with a completely new plan for their assignment. The squadron spent their time maintaining the aircraft, maintaining other equipment, and of course keeping their flying skills sharp. They did get happily surprised when a few of the white pilots invited them over to join an athletic contest and general socializing, so there was a little warmth there. Josephine Baker visited from the U.S. to entertain them, and she made every effort to meld small groups of both colors together with the local Moroccans with whom she was acquainted. Unfortunately, 5 of that first group that went over died in the line of duty. Regardless of the conditions, the airmen were excited to be in the mix on various kinds of missions, such as dive bombing, strafing, and of course, escorting bombers and ship convoys to protect them from enemy fighters' attacks. However, they soon discovered that they were not being challenged by the enemy because the war had already been won in North Africa. Following the North African conflict, the Tuskegee Airmen were anxious for their next assignment and soon got their wish. In early June of 43, their mission was to strafe the Italian island of Pantelleria. Still, they were not challenged, and flying seemed like practice. Pantelleria is down, you know, Italy. There's a foot, and then there's a little football or boot or something. It's still out in the water. It's just a little dinky place. In June 1943, an escort mission, the enemy engaged them, and they learned a valuable lesson. the lesson. All training and practice could teach them combat skills, but only combat could teach them attack skills. The most thankful element of that day was they all returned safely to base that night. From then on, they flew daily. The air war over Pantelleria was short-lived due to that country or that city area surrendering 2 days later. That island was the first enemy territory to surrender solely from air power. And this was due to the 99th and their excellent flying. The 99th was flying every day in missions that included escort service, flying cover, scrambling in response to reports of approaching aircraft. Most of their flights lasted from 1 to 2 hours, so they were not very long on any one flight. Consequently, they usually flew 2 and sometimes 3 missions per day. This was draining and tiring for the pilots, but more so for their mechanics, who had little turnaround time to repair damage, load armaments, and refuel. But these men were determined to show they were there to accomplish what they came over to do. One evening there was a victory roll for a pilot as he came in for landing. And everyone knew that he had shot down an enemy plane. Lieutenant Charles B. Hall became the first black flyer to shoot down an enemy. That's proof. He did it in a dogfight. Rightfully so, he was lauded by President Eisenhower for his success. Secretary of War Henry Stimson praised Lieutenant Colonel Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., the fighter squadron commander, on behalf of Lieutenant Hall for his success in the air that day, and to the other squadron members, that means all the rest of them, with these words: "We are all very glad of the splendid activity of a fighter squadron commanded by Lieutenant B.O. Davis, Jr. over Pantelleria." Other shout-outs were received from those who were elated about Hall's heroics. Hall was presented with a surprise. I don't think I have the... No, I don't. He was presented with a surprise. Days before, while in transit north from Tunisia, someone saw a lone bottle of Coca-Cola in the market and bought it to present it to the first pilot who shot down an enemy plane. And so it had been chilled for Hall. Lastly, Hall was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for valor in the air. Sadly, that same day, the squadron lost 2 members in a mid-air collision. But that kill of an enemy flying fighter plane by Hall was the beginning of the squadron becoming recognized for their bravery, their tenacity, and their accuracy. Also, they were beginning to settle into a daily routine of flying, escorting bombers, strafing enemy airfields, dive bombing enemy supply warehouses, trains, along with highways and bridges. Soon enough, the 99th reached German soil and began the serious business of engaging the enemy over his own soil. Railroad trains, munition dumps, bridges, factories, bunkers, airfields, all sorts of vital targets went up in flames due to their bombardment or the bombing of the 33rd Fighter Squadron bombers they had escorted. While still in North Africa, they received the new P-40s to fly. These were not the fastest planes, especially when matched with the German fighters, but they held more armaments than what they had been flying. The government, our government, was building a warplane on the cheap in order to get our squadrons filled with quality aircraft to match the German fleet. But to the 99th, these were new aircraft, and it was a step in the right direction. They were getting recognized a little bit. The 99th prevailed. Before leaving the United States, the airmen seldom faced prejudice on their own base from outsiders. Only when they ventured into town, once they arrived in North Africa, things became different. And we talked about that, how they landed in this dusty field. But while they were deployed in North Africa, the 99th were given those P-40s, which to them were newer than what they had trained. Actually, second-hand aircraft were still older and slower than what the white flyers were flying, because they had been handed down from them, thereby keeping the black squadron at a distinct disadvantage. Yet they made the most of whatever aircraft they had. The pilots of the 99th were deeply immersed in the air war. By 1944, they had flown a estimated 3,000 missions and 300 missions and 3,277 sorties in the Mediterranean. They were flying, if you know the map again, if you know southern Italy, and you go all the way up to the very top, and they were fighting their way all the way through. And let's see. Rome is right over in here someplace, just on the other side of Pantelleria. And they were eventually moved and stationed. This became their permanent base in Ramitelli. And that's where they flew all the flights that they were mainly from there up into Germany. And they made that flight so many times. One of the things that they found out was that with the shortage of black flyers, of black pilots, they were flying, some of them had flown 80 to 150 flights, whereas the whites were flying only 50, and they were rotating back home. There weren't enough black flyers to do this, and so they were going back home. And this was very draining on these guys, very debilitating, and but they made the best of it. They just continued doing what they went to do, and they said, well, that's the way it is. I got a kick out of this goat here. He's on the field, and there's another one. But I wasn't there, so I don't know what the field looked like. But there's some pictures of some red tails. Now those are the P-51s. I can see it there. There's that fourth propeller. And the P-51s had the four-bladed propeller. The P-40s had the three-bladed. These were, the kids use the term boss or something. They were the big ones. But there have been a lot of stories, rumors, and myths surrounding Tuskegee Airmen, sometimes known as the Black Knights. But no story is as much discussed as their tail colors. Therefore, I will read a short passage from a book titled Black Knights. Much of life is dictated by coincidence, and thus it was with the red tails on the aircraft. At a round table discussion, several airmen were asked, who decided to paint the tails red? Now this was long after the war was over. They were just interviewing these guys. And Harry Shepard, a red tail from Jamaica, New York, was the one that answered this particular question. It was a matter of logistics, he said. At the time we began to get the P-47s, we didn't have them long enough to make the transformation. We had some silver, we had some olive drab. We began to get the P-51s in. We had the checkerboards, we had the candy stripes, and we got the yellowtails and everything. Let me back up here a little and give you a little explanation. The Red Tails painted their planes just like all the rest of the squadrons painted their planes. A lot of it was for the esprit de corps. It was for easy identification in the air. Something for the mechanics to do. But the 99th were getting these planes in so fast from all the squadrons, and they really need to do something to identify and identify themselves as a group. Again, esprit de corps. And we found out. So we scouted around, and we found out that they had an overflow of what they called red insignia paint. This was down in Tunisia where they were. So the convoy started back with red paint. Then we had a little conversation. These were all maintenance people. The painters would say, let's not overdo this thing. So we decided to paint the red tails, the empennage, and the red trim tabs, and the nose spinners there. And you can't see the other, which made the painters happy because they had the work to do. And this was the brightest red that I have ever seen. It was called insignia red. Then someone asked, weren't warplanes painted with red tails an easier target? The answer was a resounding no. I heard somebody say something, I think. I think so. The red tails made identification easier for the bombardier gunners being escorted as the easiest way to recognize a buddy. It also helped the airmen in the thick of a dogfight. The color of the 332nd aircraft made no difference to the German gunners on the ground since they saw only silhouettes. Most of the airmen dreaded the German anti-aircraft artillery more than engagement with the German fighter at altitude. That was man-to-man, machine against machine. The unknown, hidden in the clouds of gray, dirty smoke from flak, was more dangerous. So that tells you why, when, where, and what of the red tails. The 99th Fighter Squadron, along with the 100th, the 301st, and the 302nd, combined to make up the 332nd Fighter Pursuit Group. The 477th, no, I don't, let's see. I think that one picture didn't get in there. I had... This was interesting here with, they look like really small little planes, and I think those were the P-40s. Anyway, interesting enough, the pilots began to sense the end of Germany's ability to wage war. They noticed a lack of aggression from the German pilots and wondered why. So they flew close to them to get a good look. To their amazement, they saw pilots who looked to be third, fourth graders. Here were guys in their late teens and early 20s going against mere children, so they would wave, peel away, and head home. Other instances were when they bombed or strafed an airfield or a munitions security facility, and there would be no fireballs rising from the wreckage. Then they knew the Germans were running out of fuel and running out of munitions. So they had a very, very early indication that the war was draining down. I want to mention just a little about the 477. This is now the mid-40s. The World War II was winding down in the Europe and was picking up, of course, in the Eastern countries, or Asian countries. But the black press, black clergy, black people in general, the NAACP, they were back in the White House stumping for blacks to become crew members. Now, these are planes becoming more sophisticated. They become two engines, and they have more than one pilot flying them. And so this is the kind of flying that the commercial airliners were going to have when the war went out. And so they said, look, we got to get some blacks trained in crew flying, and because we want these guys to have crew flying on their resumes so that they, when they go to become commercial pilots, they are shown that they're qualified and be more readily available for employment. Well, by that time, the federal government was tired. I think they just spent the money, and they said, look, we've done this one time and we aren't going to do it again. So they found a base near Michigan called Selfridge Field, near Detroit, in fact. And they put a guy on it who was a hardcore racist, and he kept the black training program pretty well buttoned up. His name was Colonel Selway, and the officers' club there had been integrated until he showed up. He stepped on base and changed all that, which created an instant fireball. So the Air Force decided to move the blacks. Go figure. You guys, we don't like you, so we're going to move you. So they moved them down to Indiana. But another thing about training this for crews, for bombers, there was about 12 guys on a plane. They had 2 pilots, a number of gunners, a couple of navigators, and I forgot what the other part of it was. Co-pilots and navigator bombardiers. There we go, the bombardiers. And they couldn't just train them all at one place. They might have a group of 25 bombardiers, and they're going to put them someplace, and then they need to have the gunners train someplace else. So this became a very haphazard and exceedingly expensive proposition to try to figure out how to train them. And Selway, being the kind of segregationist that he was, he said, I don't want black people. I'm just not going to mess with them. So the entire program then was moved to Freeman Field in Indiana, and if it hadn't already fallen apart, it did then. And the primary reason was segregation. Commander Selway, the hardcore segregationist, would not bend to assist in promoting the program, but went out of his way to achieve total failure. And the guy, his boss, was the same way. For instance, now this seems crazy, but it happened. For instance, this base had been used to hold German prisoners of war. Now I hope that all of you remember that a lot of prisoners of war in World War II, German prisoners was held here in the United States. Their clothes had been gladly washed. These are the German prisoners, had been gladly washed by a local laundry, but that laundry refused to wash the clothes of the black aviators. I will close this awful tale of hatred with these comments spoken by one of the group of airmen interviewed by the Pittsburgh Courier. They were in part, we were not mad, but just disgusted with the rewards for our efforts. And I call that Major Grace under fire. Things are winding down. There was a Time magazine report of a major victory on January 27th and 28th in 1944. The 99th Fighter Squadron was involved in a massive air war over Rome beachhead. They had been teamed with British squadrons, with the Red Guerrillas, as well as Army Warhawk Squadron. These are other squadrons that you can look them up on the internet if you want. Anyway, the 99th scored impressive victories, that is, 12 kills, 2 probables, and 4 damaged. Sadly, they suffered 3 P-40s damaged and 1 pilot dead. A few months prior to these air battles, Time magazine had printed an article based on a report of a questionable and derogatory nature. There were many of these reports continually being written and circulated for the express purpose of discrediting the 99th and the total Tuskegee experience. After these After these 99th Squadron exploits reached Time magazine, they printed another article which espoused truthful information as well as many other glowing reports. And here I quote, "Any outfit would have been proud of combat excellence of one of the most controversial outfits in the Army." They continued, "They had finally got their big chance flying cover for the Allied beachhead, and they knew what to do with it." They continued, "The squadron was veteran, well-led, sure of itself." And they ended their quote by saying, "The Air Corps regarded this experiment proven and is taking on all qualified Negro cadets it can get." That, folks, is the kind of report the 99th should have been receiving all along. I'm going to read some statistics. The Tuskegee experience, a lot of statistics, a lot of counts, a lot of this and that and the other. But Theophilus W. Johnson, a researcher, historian, and also a Tuskegee Airman, came up with this following information. And he calls them DOTA, D-O-T-A. That means Documented Original Tuskegee Airmen. And that is anyone, man or woman, military or civilian, black or white, who served at Tuskegee Army Airfield or in any of the programs stemming from the Tuskegee experience between the years of 1941 and 1949 is considered to be a documented original Tuskegee Airman. There were an estimated 16 to 19,000 persons in the above category, of which 14,632 have been personally documented by Johnson. He also noted that there were 929 American pilots that graduated. There were 5 Haitian pilots, 11 instructor pilots, and 51 liaison pilots. And I was as interested in knowing what a liaison pilot is. Imagine you guys are. So I did look that one up. A liaison pilot, now, did I have that picture? Yes, yeah, all right. Their mission was to haul messages, transport commanders, haul light cargo, and were used for battlefield reconnaissance and as airplane ambulances. Many were called smack dab in the middle of air wars, as was this fella, Walton I. Taylor. I chose him due to his last name. I don't know whether he's related, but I'll let any of you do the genealogy work to see if he and I are related. Taylor survived the war in Asia, and he went on to the second half of the war in the other side of the world, and he authored this book, 2 Steps from Glory. This is I don't know why I mentioned it. This is fabric covered. But he crashed that thing so many times and he survived. They don't know how he did. But he did. So that's a liaison officer. I never could really figure out whether the Army didn't want him or just what the deal was, but they obviously didn't give him a legitimate planes, but they flew some very critical kinds of runs. The total pilot graduates, they say there were 996 graduates, 686 were single wing, and 248 were twin engine planes. The first class graduated 5 single engine pilots, and Benjamin O. Davis was one of those. And that was on March 7th, 1942. And the last class that graduated was June 28, 1946, and it had 8 single-wing and 5 twin-engine. So the last class graduated the same amount as the first class entered total. 2,483 persons were pilot trainees at Moulton Field and Tuskegee Army Airfield from July 19, 1941 until June 28, 1946, and 996 of those graduated from Tuskegee. Tuskegee Airfield closed August 20th, 1946, and of the graduates, 352 were deployed overseas in Europe. 84 Tuskegee Airmen were killed overseas during World War II. 80 pilots lost their lives in combat training, flying, and 9 flying accidents. And 68 were identified as either killed in action or missing in action. 12 pilots were killed overseas in training accidents or non-combat related incidents. 30 pilots were drowned or captured as POWs, and 4 enlisted persons were killed overseas while in the performance of their duties. There were 1,267 missions, or 6,381 combat sorties with the 12th Army. 311 missions and 9,152 combat sorties. So a lot of times they were out on their own, but they did 9,152 combat sorties with the 15th Air Force. That was over a 1-year period of June 44 to May 45. And 179 of those 311 were for escort duty. So the total number of missions they did was 1,578. The total combat sorties was 15,533. And the total aerial kills was 112. They went over a list of some of the combat awards. There were 3 unit citation awards. Benjamin O. Davis won 2 awards. There were 96 Distinguished Flying Crosses, 8 Purple Hearts, and 25 Bronze Stars. And one unusual one was the Red Star of Yugoslavia. Again, that piqued my interest. What in the world would a black man be doing getting the award from Yugoslavia? So, First Lieutenant William W. Green, I don't think I have his picture. No, I don't. I'll let you look at some more red tails. First Lieutenant William W. Green was on a strafing mission to Yugoslavia to take out a munitions dump. He was successful to the target, but while returning to base, his plane was hit and he had to bail out. During the time the Germans were searching for him, he was found by Yugoslavian partisans who sheltered him for 4 days, then turned him over to the Russians, who took him to Naples, France. Over a year later, Green, who held a Distinguished Flying Cross with 6 oak leaves clusters, 3 battle stars, and a Purple Heart, these are all from the U.S. Army, was awarded Yugoslavian's Partisan Medal 3rd class for his troubles. Lastly, I think I've got about 2 or 3 more minutes here. Back in 2012, and I think it was then, there was a man that was here, a Tuskegee Airman. I don't know how many, he gave a talk, it was right in this room. But his name is Ben Flapsberry. Ben was born February 17, 1925, and died on September 30th, 2013 at the age of 88. He was an aerospace engineer, was on the technical staff of Apollo, Space Station, and Space Shuttle. He was in Congressional Medal of Honor by virtue of being a Tuskegee Airman. He designed the first computerized fly-by-wire system. You can ask Dwayne about that. He explained it to me. And he has numerous designs, patents, and technical proposals. I met Ben when he gave a talk to SSI probably in 2012. At that time, he had been living in the Portland area approximately 1 year before his local relatives had yet to take him to the Evergreen Air and Space Museum. Well, I took care of that. We went down, and due to bone cancer, he was unable to walk distances, so I rode him in a wheelchair. He was a grand man with a brilliant mind and gifted as an interesting conversationalist. He was welcomed by the local pilots and aviation enthusiasts acting as docents who happened to be stationed around there that particular time. We enjoyed our time together, and I returned him to the care center where he lived in Milwaukee. Although I talked to him a time or two after that afternoon, I never saw him again. There is a story that Del Smith, owner of the Evergreen Air and Space Museum, built a chapel on the property in which to hold events, and one event was a memorial service for Ben on October 12th, 2013. That was just a couple weeks after he died. The memorial included full military honors for Ben Flaps Berry. Here he is, a young pilot, and here he is, an old man. Now, Ben was not among the graduates. The war ended before he finished his training, and we were talking. He said, I am a Tuskegee Airman, but he said, I really was disappointed that I didn't get a chance to fly. And one thing I don't think I mentioned this, but when you are a Tuskegee Airman, is always a Tuskegee Airman. They never say that I was a Tuskegee Airman or I used to be. I am Tuskegee Airman. Thank you. Here's a book. Oh, yeah. I was going to say, here's the book that he wrote. Anybody can look at it and see my name in it. He autographed it for me. Yes.
My understanding
You have to talk to Linda because I can't hear you.
is that a lot of the white bombers requested the Tuskegee Airmen to be their
I think I did get what you said.
the bombers wanted their escorts to be there.
She said you requested this?
No, a lot of the bombers, the people with the bombers would request their protection.
Oh yeah. That was there were so many things that I didn't bring up, but with all the segregation, all of the stuff, we don't want black pilots doing this. Anytime they went out, they came back and they flew better cover and had less down planes. And so it finally got that the white guy said, I don't care what color is flying these planes. If I can, it seemed like I can be assured of getting back home and getting back to my family at some point in time with these guys, with these red tails. I want them. I don't want anybody else to fly me, to escort me. And one of the things that came up was that they first were not given due for what they were doing. Benjamin O. Davis, their commander, said, I want you to fly close to the bombers. Don't leave the bombers and go chasing some fighter that's way over here. You're here to protect the bombers. Stay with the bombers. So in that respect, they weren't getting all these stray kills around there. But the bombers, the bomber pilots and crews were saying, these guys are here to protect us, and these guys are protecting us. We want them. We don't want these other guys that are off chasing enemy planes. And so that's how they built their reputation, doing what they went to do, doing it the correct way. I will say that Miss Raz is the one that kind of put the bug in my ear. I did, back in April, I did a talk, 5 profiles, And one was a guy named Robert Taylor, and the other, I can't remember his name. But these were both black architects, designers, engineers. One grew up in Iowa and the other one in the South. But they did a lot of work on the Tuskegee campus, built a lot of the infrastructure, built the runways that we talked about a little while ago, built the hangars and all of these buildings. So they were very involved in building Tuskegee Institute, and also building and creating the runways and all the infrastructure for the Tuskegee School and Moton Field. And so when we talked about that, she says, "Can you give us a talk about the Tuskegee Airmen?" I said, "I'll do the best I can." Thank you.